Thank you. Hi, one moment. Let me do a share screen. Okay, do you guys see the screen that's basically just the title, Interstate Compact and Caregivers? Yes, is that the screen you guys are
Yes,
seeing?
sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's okay. My name is Shannon Freeman. I am the Interstate Compact Program Manager. In the ICPC world, we call it a Deputy Compact Administrator. That just means I've been given the authority in Washington to help make policies and rules around ICPC so that we can make sure that we're following the laws. We work really hard with a lot of our collaborators on getting those type of things done. I do want to preference because I saw some guardian ad litems and CASAs jump on. I really tailored this to caregivers that live in Washington. They're getting a child from another state. So I do a training for CASAs and GALs generally twice a year. Ryan Murray reaches out and we do that separately, or I'm happy to come to meetings as well and do that. But I just want to let you know that this is going to be more heavily for caregivers to make sure that we can get them what they need. So really just some goals of the presentation. What and why is ICPC needed? The responsibilities of both states. What's the process for ICPC? What are timeframes are we working under? Some challenges and tips that might help caregivers. And then, of course, as Luann mentioned, we will have time for questions. I've been in Interstate Compact for about 12 years. And before that, I did other things within the agency. So I kind of have the full gamut of working with kinship providers and foster parent providers. I really appreciate all that you guys do for families. And we recognize that we are sometimes challenging to work with because there are rules and policies that we have to kind of follow, but it gets really challenging when you're trying to navigate and learn the process. So I hope I can help that out a little bit today. So we call it the compact sometimes. So Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children. What a compact is generally the uniform legislation that states enter into. So in this compact, in the ICPC compact, all states are members, as well as the District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So all states have this law in their state, and the law has to be enacted the same way. This really came about back in the 60s when states were having trouble getting services for children and families when they lived in other states. And it kind of started on the East Coast. You know, a lot of those states are really small. You can drive from one end to another in 2 hours, like a lot of those that are really, really close together. They had no way to get a kid medical in another state. They had no way for somebody to see the child in that state. So this really came about that long ago. So Washington's law, I have it on the slide. The law can't change unless a majority of the states, at least 35, decide that we can change the law. So that takes a long time. This law is pretty old, so we kind of do updates regarding what practices all the states can agree on and what kind of things look like when states have to submit a request to us. We have been able to update those over time, but those things can't be put into the law. The ICPC, what some people don't know is it covers dependent children and private placements if those placements are for private adoption or group care placement. So we do a whole separate work with private agencies and attorneys if a family or a birth parent lives in another state. But I'm not going to focus on that today. I just wanted people to be aware that the law is not just for dependent children, is to kind of safeguard what's happening when children are placed in another state. Part of the law requires that the state or the entity retain their jurisdiction. So that's going to kind of come in. That might give you some clicks when we talk about why it might take a while for another state to submit an ICPC request, or what some of the delays are. So the retention of jurisdiction written in the law is important in that way. I just want to put some key terms up here because it's kind of easier to talk about certain things when we talk about there's two states involved, right? So we have a state that has the authority to place the child based on some type of legal intervention, and we call that the sending state. They're the state that wants to send the child to a different state. And then we have the receiving state. So in the purposes of this training, Washington is the receiving state. The other state's asking us to complete a home study, and if it's approved and the child is placed, to provide ongoing supervision. Each state has an ICPC office, or in the cases of, there are some states that are county-based, each county has an ICPC office. That office assures that the laws are followed, that the rules are adhered to make sure that children and families are getting what they deserve to get when placed in another state, and to make sure some of those protections and services follow the child. Courtesy supervision. When a child is placed on an approved ICPC, courtesy supervision is that monthly health and safety visit, or twice a month visit in some cases, to assess the child's placement, how's it going, and then we send a report back to that other state that sent the child here, and that work is done through the ICPC offices as well. So why is the law needed? Well, a couple different things. For children, it protects them, that they're entitled to the same protections that they would if they were in their home state. So that protection is going to be a home study, some financial and medical support, all of those type of things. It guarantees the legal and financial protections as well. When I talked about jurisdiction, the sending state has to maintain that jurisdiction so that they can ensure the child gets these items that they need while they're placed in Washington. So for the sending state, it allows them the opportunity to achieve a home study on the proposed family. It gets somebody to supervise the placement and the reports on the child's safety and well-being. They can do their case management while the child's placed in a familiar placement. They're still tasked with going to court, like I said, maintaining jurisdiction, and also helps get permanency achieved. Here in Washington, we are the receiving state in this situation. We are able to assess a placement here in Washington and make that determination to the other state if a child can be placed or not. We would provide supervision of the child and recommend any services that the worker felt might be necessary. And we also help achieve permanency. So a lot of times I get questioned about ICPC takes a long time. So when ICPC is a couple different things, it's not only the law, it's the home study, the supervision, and all of those protections that come with that. But for states, for workers in the other state, in that sending state, when it's the time in their case plan under their jurisdiction, so they generally have to have jurisdiction of the child, be able to make decisions on placement. They have to maintain their jurisdiction. So that means sometimes if they're just in the investigative stage and they just want to place the child temporarily somewhere while they do an investigation, they don't have jurisdiction of the child yet. That might be a family. The parents might have allowed that with another family member in their state, but they don't have the authority to place the child yet legally. So that's where we talk about the retention of jurisdiction. In the other slide, they have to be able to make decisions on that before they submit an ICPC request, because we want to know, states want to know that another state's just not going to send a child and then not provide any services. They need to be able to have access to medical, a home study, financial support for that placement while the child's here, which kind of follows all of that with ICPC. I just included the packets that the worker has to send just for people's knowledge. Sometimes I get asked, like, why does it take so long for them to get the paperwork together? And it is like they have to, we need a court report. We have to know that what the case plan is. We need information about the child. We need to be able to assess that those services are available in the community where the family lives. We need to be able to recommend if higher services are going to be needed based on that information in the packet. Because an ICPC home study is child specific, we kind of have to wait until we get that packet of information so that we know what we're assessing. The other state gets to decide what type of home study we complete, so that all of that information is in that ICPC packet. When we get it here in Washington, it gets reviewed at the headquarters ICPC level. We kind of cover the whole state, and then we review and assign it out to licensing division for a home study. That process in licensing, they reach out to the family, they provide a link to get started with the paperwork. If people don't want to do electronically, they have other avenues to do that. They just kind of went to the I believe it's called WACAP system to be able to fill out paperwork and those things online as a way to speed that process up. The home study timeframes under the compact are 60 to 180 days. That's what the compact says, that a home study shouldn't take longer than 180 days. The sooner families engage and get things completed, of course, minimizes that time frame. So for ICPC home studies, our agency, DCYF, completes the type of home study the other state requests. So there's really 3 types of home study that the other state can request: relative home study, foster home study, adoption, or foster adopt. The other state can only request a type of home study that's allowed by their policies. So for example, some states can't ask for an adoption home study before the child's legally free. So we can't do that home study on the family. Or some states, an adoption home study might only be valid for 1 year, and they're not into that process yet. They're still looking at returning to parents, but want the child to be with family until that happens, so they can't ask for that type of home study yet. So it really is up to the other state what type of home study they want to request. You may also know that there are child placing agencies, private agencies that license or do adoptive home stays here in Washington. For another state to use those agencies, they would have to contract with that agency to do that work. And not all states are able to do that. It's not allowable in their policies. So I always caution people to not just go out and get a home stay with a private agency unless you know that state is going to contract with that agency, because then you're doing the process kind of twice. So that makes it difficult when we find out that that might have happened to a family and then they kind of have to start over. For families, just some tips. Respond quickly when you're contacted by licensing to begin the home study, the assessment worker. If ICPC is approved, it is valid for 6 months. It is up to that sending state, that state that has jurisdiction over the child, when they place that child in your home, or if they place that child in their home. So we don't have a way to advocate for that or do any work on that, because we're doing those things as a courtesy. It's up to their case plan. Maybe they've looked at 2 or 3 different relatives and are making their decision based on that. But if the child is placed in the approved home in Washington, the other state gives us notification that a child is placed, and we open that case for courtesy supervision. The Washington worker has 30 days to see the child. We always recommend to our Washington workers to at least call the family and tell them how medical is going to happen, because it can happen 2 ways here in Washington, how medical happens and your contact information. So if they have questions before you can go out and do that first health and safety, at least they have a contact information. So hopefully that's happening more often than not, but that is our recommendation to our courtesy workers in Washington. The courtesy worker will know the medical plan. And I say that because when we send the assignment out, we tell them that either we've activated it and sent the information to the healthcare authority to turn on medical, or the family has to apply for medical, and here's the instructions. So the courtesy workers have that information to hopefully streamline that. Maintaining contact with the worker in both states is important. The worker in the sending state still has to know what's happening with the child. They might need different updates from court. They're your go-to as far as they're responsible for any foster payment or maintenance payment, if that was in the financial plan. And of course, have to report to the court on what's happening with the child. And then the worker here in Washington, you're seeing them for health and safety visits. They might recommend services that would benefit or help with the family, and we report that back to the other state as well. If you are foster licensed, you need to maintain your foster license while the child is placed. That is both to receive that foster reimbursement, but if that is the approval that the child is placed on, if you're no longer licensed, we don't have an approval anymore. So we need that foster approval to be maintained. It's a good idea to know your financial medical plan. So the sending state worker has to complete that when they submit the ICPC packet. So just asking what that is. Are they going to reimburse foster payments? Do I need to apply for TANF? What's the medical plan? They should be able to direct you and tell you what that is. The compact also sets some responsibilities for each state. So again, the sending state, the state that's responsible jurisdictionally for the child, they're going to do the financial reimbursement, whatever the financial plan is in the packet, and per their state policies. So there are some states that can reimburse a payment no matter if you're licensed or not. So that's up to that sending state, and they would be able to tell you that information. Services that are not covered by Washington Medicaid, if that's additional services the child's need that is a payment for, the sending state has to either contract with those services or make payment to be able to access those services. If for some reason Washington Medicaid was denied, then it is the responsibility of the sending state to figure out a different medical plan. That's pretty rare that it's denied, but there are some situations that some states can't open medical. So if that happens, you'll just have to talk to the sending state worker to figure out what a plan might be. Daycare doesn't show up on the financial plan for us. So it's always important to talk to the other worker to find out if daycare is paid for by their state or reimbursed by their state and how. I know it's always a challenge if people don't know if that's going to happen when the child's placed here, but please ask those questions so that you are prepared for that. Some states will pay for daycare, some states will not pay for daycare. And families can apply for assistance for that if that other state isn't reimbursing for daycare. The sending state retains their custody jurisdiction, and all of the case planning is still done by that sending state. Here in Washington is the receiving state. We're doing the home study, the courtesy supervision, information on how to access Medicaid. As I mentioned, currently there's a couple ways we do that, either based on the child in the placement, we're turning the Medicaid on, or the family applies for that. And then sending any recommendations for resources, supports that might be provided to the families. So I would say if it's a hardship for families to not get the foster care reimbursement or to be able to not get daycare paid, let the sending state worker know, let the courtesy worker know, because there's sometimes we can advocate for you in that way to get the other state to make payment or maybe increase the subsidy payment that's being paid for a foster care rate to be able to get daycare paid in Washington. Daycare, I don't know how people do that. Daycare is expensive, you guys. Daycare is expensive. A little bit about permanency across state lines. So if the child, of course, all state agencies, our goal is to return children to parents. But if the child isn't returned to a parent and you are the identified resource for permanency, that may require a new home study. If a child's been in your home, say under a relative approval, and now the plan is adoption, the other state is now going to submit an adoption request. It doesn't look very different from the original home study, but there are some additional things that are covered in that adoption home study. So that just get added to that original home study that was completed. But all of that is done when the child's placed, the child's been placed in your home usually by that time. We don't close the case until there's a period of stable supervision. So in the law, it talks about the state has to maintain their jurisdiction. So they have to ask our permission basically to close their case. It doesn't mean we get to decide on what the plan is, if it's guardianship or adoption or some other type of transfer of custody to a relative or kinship provider, but they need us to tell them that things are going well, things are stable, families able to access services that they need, and yes, we're in agreement to close that plan. That's really to protect families and children, to make sure that they have what they need. They're comfortable with whatever the ongoing support might be for that child. If there's a payment after adoption or guardianship, what that might look like, so that they can help that child into their adulthood. So some challenges and tips. A lot of people are unfamiliar with ICPC just because they don't do it a lot. I was a caseworker for over 5 years, and I did 2 during that time. I did 2 ICPCs when I was a line worker. So it's not something that people do every day. So, when you don't do it every day, you don't know what those processes are. And states can have differences. Some states require relatives to be licensed. So when we get that request from another state, that might be one of the requirements. I already mentioned the example of some states can't request an adoption home study before termination of parental rights. So all of those things kind of play into the fact of how the study or that information is going to come. It's really recognizable that timeframes can be frustrating if states can't request an ICPC until they have jurisdiction, but your relative is in that other state in foster care, or maybe with another relative that's not a long-term resource. We recognize that is frustrating. Some states have to be court ordered before they send the ICPC request. So just when we talk about what's taking so long or why can't states do that, just knowing some of those things or asking is a good. I always recommend when people call me and ask these questions, ask them when can they submit an ICPC? At what point in the case can you submit that, or what needs to happen before you can submit that, just so at least you have that information. And communication, just maintaining contact with the people involved in that. If there's a CASA or guardian ad litem in the other state, make sure that they have your contact information. The social workers might change more frequently, so the CASA or the guardian ad litem might be the person that is with the kid the longest, if they have that in those states. Communicating with your licensor after you're licensed, or your home study writer, that information. And that's kind of all I have for kind of the big overview, because I thought there might be a lot of questions. So I wanted to leave time for questions.